By December 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolving at a pace no one inside its industrial ministries could control. The factories that once symbolized central planning now exposed its deepest failures. Among them stood AvtoVAZ, the pride of Soviet manufacturing, functioning at a fraction of its capacity. Assembly lines that had once produced more than 500,000 vehicles a year were slowed to a crawl. Shipments of steel, plastics, bearings, and wiring looms arrived inconsistently or not at all. Workers experienced months-long delays in wages. The machinery, installed more than 2 decades earlier, ran with increasing instability, held together by improvised repairs and stripped components. And the Lada, once the Soviet Union's most important civilian export, no longer had the technical or commercial value needed to support the system that depended on it. The Soviet Union's economic model was collapsing, and the automotive industry revealed its structural weaknesses with exacting clarity. Central planners had overestimated output, underestimated the cost of maintaining advanced machinery, and relied on export sales to buffer the state's limited access to foreign currency. By the start of the 1990s, these mechanisms had failed simultaneously. The Lada was no longer competitive in Western markets, production had stalled, and AvtoVAZ could no longer perform its critical role in supporting the state's industrial finances. This was the point where the consequences of decisions made decades earlier converged. Understanding how the nation reached this moment requires a return to the late 1950s, when the Soviet leadership confronted a problem that shaped the next 30 years of its industrial strategy. After Nikita Khrushchev assumed leadership in 1953, one of his central priorities was improving living standards. Housing, food, and consumer goods were identified as the most urgent domains. Automobiles, however, were treated differently, not as luxury items, but as industrial symbols. Khrushchev believed that providing citizens with personal vehicles would demonstrate the strength of socialism and the capability of centralized planning. But the Soviet Union lacked a civilian auto industry capable of supporting mass production. Factories such as Gaz, ZIL, and Moscovich existed, yet their output remained limited. Gaz produced durable sedans based on earlier American designs, but in volumes too small to meet a population of more than 200 million. Moscovich built compact passenger cars, but they were relatively expensive, technologically outdated, and constrained by production bottlenecks. ZIL focused on trucks and government limousines. None of these plants could achieve the scale or efficiency necessary for a modern, nationwide automotive sector. By 1963, the State Committee for Automotive Industry presented a detailed assessment of the nation's capability. Their conclusion was unequivocal. The USSR required an entirely new factory, equipped with modern automation, large-scale stamping facilities, integrated component production, and an engineering base capable of sustaining continuous development. The factory would need to produce at least 400,000 cars annually, with the potential to expand to 600,000, numbers that aligned with Western producers such as Fiat, Renault, and Volkswagen. The Soviet leadership accepted the proposal. What they lacked, however, was a suitable vehicle platform and the industrial expertise to construct a plant on this scale within a short frame time. This is when the search for a foreign partner began. The Ministry of Foreign Trade and the State Committee for Automotive Industry examined potential candidates across Europe. Western Germany's manufacturers were dismissed for political reasons. British firms were technologically capable but financially unstable. French companies were considered but had limited interest in the project. Italy, however, represented a strategic opportunity. Fiat, under the leadership of Gianni Agnelli, had developed efficient production lines, modern stamping equipment, and compact vehicle platforms that could be adapted for various conditions. Its factories in Turin and Mirafari served as models of post-war industrial reconstruction. The Soviets saw Fiat as a practical partner. Fiat saw the USSR as a massive market and a chance to cement its influence on global automotive development. Negotiations began in 1965. Delegations from Fiat and the USSR met in Turin and Moscow, examining technical specifications, factory designs, and financial arrangements. Engineers, economists, and planners from both sides evaluated the feasibility of transferring not only a vehicle model, but an entire production ecosystem. The Soviets needed a car that could operate in extreme temperatures, survive poor road conditions, and remain maintainable with basic tools. Fiat proposed an adapted version of its 124 sedan, which had just won the 1967 European Car of the Year award. To meet Soviet durability requirements, it required reinforcement, stronger suspension components, thicker steel panels, a more robust drivetrain, and modifications to accommodate winter operation. On August 15, 1966, the contract between Fiat and the Soviet Union was signed. It represented one of the largest industrial agreements of the Cold War. Fiat would assist in designing the plant, training engineers, supplying machinery, and adapting the Fiat 124 platform to Soviet standards. In return, the USSR would pay partly in hard currency and partly in long-term trade agreements involving raw materials. Construction began almost immediately. The selected site was an undeveloped region near the Volga River. The location was chosen for strategic reasons: access to water transport, railway connections, and the potential to build a modern city around the plant. This area soon became Togliatti, named after Palmiro Togliatti, the Italian communist leader who had long-standing ties to the Soviet Union. The construction of the plant began in 1967, involving more than 40,000 workers, hundreds of Italian engineers, and thousands of specialists from Soviet ministries. It became one of the largest industrial construction projects in Soviet history. By 1969, the first assembly lines were operational. Stamping presses capable of handling the thickened steel sheets were installed. Automated welding machines, imported from Italy, were integrated with Soviet power and control systems. Engine machining centers, transmission production lines, and component plants were arranged to minimize transport distances and maintain consistent flow. The scale was unmatched in the Soviet industrial landscape. It was not simply a factory. It was a fully integrated automotive complex designed to function with the efficiency of Western industrial models. The first VAZ 2101, later known globally as the Lada 1200, rolled off the assembly line in April 1970. The launch marked a turning point in Soviet consumer history. For the first time, the USSR produced a vehicle that could compete in reliability and cost with Western models. Demand was immediate. Domestic buyers entered waiting lists that often extended several years. Export partners across Eastern Europe and the developing world placed orders. Even Western markets, including countries like the United Kingdom and France, became viable targets for distribution. By the early 1970s, AvtoVAZ represented not only the success of the Fiat-Soviet partnership, but the foundation of the USSR's industrial strategy. It provided the state with an efficient means of supplying consumer goods and, more critically, a method for acquiring foreign currency. And as the Soviet leadership would soon learn, this reliance on a single manufacturer and a single car created a vulnerability that would grow silently over the next 2 decades. By 1971, AvtoVAZ had become the most productive automotive plant in the Eastern Bloc. The VAZ 2101 formed the backbone of its output, and its engineering modifications, reinforced suspension arms, a single overhead camshaft engine adapted for Soviet fuels, corrosion-resistant body panels, and strengthened drivetrain components proved essential for the wide range of climates across the USSR. Production accelerated rapidly. Within a year, output exceeded 380,000 units, approaching the scale originally envisioned by central planners. By 1973, annual production surpassed 500,000 units, making AvtoVAZ one of the largest car manufacturers in Europe. The plant's early success depended heavily on the foundation laid by Fiat engineers, including figures such as Giuseppe Petrilli, who oversaw automation integration, and Dante Giacosa, whose engineering philosophy influenced the modified platform's simplicity and maintainability. As production stabilized, the Soviet government quickly realized that the Lada could serve a strategic purpose beyond civilian transportation.
The Soviet Union had a chronic weakness. It needed hard currency, dollars, marks, francs, or pounds, to purchase advanced machine tools, precision electronics, industrial chemicals, and grain from Western markets. The command economy could produce significant volumes of raw materials, steel, and military equipment, but it lacked the technological sophistication of Western Europe, Japan, or the United States. High-quality industrial imports were essential, but they could not be purchased with rubles. Only hard currency had the required value. Few Soviet industries could reliably generate this foreign exchange. Oil and gas exports offered the largest contribution, but their revenue fluctuated with global markets. Arms exports were profitable, but limited to friendly nations. Consumer products were scarce and often non-competitive. The Lada, however, possessed one rare advantage: Western buyers were willing to pay hard currency for it. At a time when European cars were becoming more complex and expensive, the Lada entered the market as a simple, rugged, and affordable alternative. It appealed particularly to budget-conscious buyers, first-time drivers, and rural communities. By 1974, Lada dealerships existed in more than 60 countries, including the United Kingdom, France, Finland, Belgium, and even Canada. Exports provided the USSR with hundreds of millions of dollars annually, money that directly supported its industrial ministries. The revenue purchased Western machine tools used in aviation, electronics, and metallurgy. It financed chemical equipment for fertilizer production. It supported grain imports during agricultural shortfalls. In effect, the Lada became a financial instrument, a consumer product functioning as a stabilizer for the Soviet state. This economic role shaped AvtoVAZ's priority structure. Domestic consumers often waited years for a new car, while export markets received preferential access. Western governments imposed quality requirements, and AvtoVAZ adjusted production lines accordingly. Vehicles intended for export received stricter inspections, improved finishing, and sometimes additional features. The export models reinforced the car's international reputation, while domestic buyers received simpler versions. This imbalance reflected the Soviet Union's broader economic strategy. Domestic shortages were acceptable as long as foreign currency continued to flow into the state budget. The factory expanded to meet rising demand. By 1976, AvtoVAZ introduced the VAZ 2103 and VAZ 2106, higher-spec variants featuring more powerful engines, upgraded instrumentation, and enhanced trim. These models combined Fiat's engineering principles with Soviet modifications and increasingly locally sourced components. In 1977, production began on the VAZ 2121 Niva, an off-road vehicle designed under the leadership of engineer Valery Domansky. The Niva became one of the first mass-produced unibody 4x4s in the world, achieving significant export success. Its reputation for durability further strengthened AvtoVAZ's commercial presence abroad. By the late 1970s, AvtoVAZ peaked at approximately 700,000 units per year. Tolyatti's population surged past 600,000 people, supported by expansive housing blocks, schools, hospitals, and utilities constructed to sustain the factory's workforce. The city's layout reflected Soviet industrial planning. Residential districts aligned with transportation corridors, service facilities positioned near worker housing, and infrastructure optimized to support shift-based labor cycles. AvtoVAZ was not simply an automotive plant, it was the economic nucleus of a purpose-built urban center. However, the foundations of long-term stability were already weakening. While global automotive technology advanced rapidly, Soviet industrial adaptation slowed. In Western Europe and Japan, manufacturers implemented electronic ignition systems, fuel injection, improved emission controls, lightweight materials, and advanced corrosion protection. AvtoVAZ, constrained by the command economy's limited access to new machinery, continued to rely on outdated equipment. The plant's automation systems, originally supplied by Fiat, were now more than a decade old. Replacement parts required foreign suppliers, purchased with hard currency that the Soviet Union increasingly needed elsewhere. Central planners recognized these vulnerabilities, but lacked the structural flexibility to correct them. Investment was directed toward defense industries and heavy manufacturing, leaving consumer goods sectors with insufficient modernization budgets. Even when funds were allocated, procurement processes were slow. Western manufacturers updated production technology on an annual or biannual cycle. AvtoVAZ often waited 5 to 10 years for major equipment upgrades. By 1980, the first visible symptoms of stagnation emerged. Quality control inconsistencies increased. Paint durability declined. Electrical systems suffered from intermittent failures. Variations in steel composition resulting from supply chain disruptions affected body longevity. While export models still met acceptable standards, domestic units showed clear signs of declining consistency. Yet production targets remained unchanged, forcing the factory to prioritize volume over innovation. The consequences of technological lag became more severe as global automotive standards tightened. Western governments implemented stricter safety and emissions regulations. Manufacturers responded with new engine designs, catalytic converters, onboard diagnostics, and improved crash structures. AvtoVAZ lacked the machinery and engineering base to meet these requirements. As a result, Lada models that had been acceptable in the 1970s were increasingly uncompetitive by the early 1980s. Export markets began to shrink. Some Western nations reduced import quotas. Others imposed standards that AvtoVAZ could not meet without significant retooling. This decline in export competitiveness had immediate economic implications. Hard currency revenue from Lada sales, once a stable supplement to the USSR's budget, began to contract. The Soviet state now faced a feedback loop that accelerated its financial instability. Outdated machinery limited AvtoVAZ's ability to modernize. Without modernization, export sales declined. Declining sales reduced hard currency inflows. Reduced hard currency restricted the state's ability to purchase new machinery. Without new machinery, AvtoVAZ fell further behind global standards. This dynamic, largely invisible to the general public, placed increasing pressure on the Soviet economy. The car that had once symbolized industrial progress had become a measure of stagnation. As the 1980s progressed, the gap between Western automotive technology and Soviet production methods widened dramatically. Yet AvtoVAZ remained essential to the state budget, forcing leadership to maintain unrealistic output expectations. By 1983, the consequences of 2 decades of centralized planning, limited innovation, and constrained foreign currency reserves were converging. AvtoVAZ still operated, still produced cars, and still supported Tolyatti's economy, but its position as a stabilizing force within the Soviet system was weakening. The model that had helped build a modern industrial city was becoming a structural liability.
By the mid-1980s, AvtoVAZ faced pressures that extended beyond production inefficiencies. The VAZ 2101 platform, introduced in 1970, had evolved into a family of vehicles, including the 2103, 2106, and the Niva, yet its fundamental architecture remained unchanged. Western manufacturers had advanced through electronic fuel injection, lightweight materials, corrosion-resistant coatings, and enhanced safety standards. AvtoVAZ, constrained by outdated machinery and limited hard currency, could not implement comparable upgrades. The factory's inability to modernize industrially mirrored the broader Soviet struggle, stagnation at the core of its consumer economy. Leadership at AvtoVAZ recognized these issues but lacked the autonomy to implement rapid change.
Key figures such as Viktor Polyakov, who had become director in the late 1970s, worked to adapt production processes, reorganize assembly sequences, and source alternative materials domestically. Polyakov, an engineer with extensive experience in Fiat-Soviet collaboration, attempted to implement incremental improvements to corrosion protection and engine reliability. Externally, the Lada's reputation began to erode in its primary export markets. By 1985, countries in Western Europe and Scandinavia introduced emissions and safety standards that Soviet models could not fully satisfy. The VAZ 2106, with minor modifications, could meet minimum safety requirements, but fuel efficiency and environmental compliance were increasingly inadequate. Orders declined. Finnish and French dealerships reduced volumes, while some British distributors refused new contracts. Export earnings, previously one of the Soviet Union's most reliable sources of hard currency, began to shrink. This contraction had systemic consequences. By 1986, the USSR's industrial ministries faced a dilemma. Without Lada exports, the state could not finance the import of modern machine tools or electronic components needed for other sectors. Aviation, defense electronics, and chemical processing plants relied heavily on foreign technology. Each lost dollar or mark reduced the state's ability to purchase Western equipment, creating a cascading effect throughout the command economy. AvtoVAZ, once a symbol of industrial achievement, had become a fulcrum of systemic vulnerability. Soviet leadership sought remedies. In 1987, Politburo committees debated options: invest heavily in modernizing AvtoVAZ, negotiate new technology transfers with Western partners, or allow the plant to continue incremental improvements while accepting reduced exports. The first two options were constrained by hard currency shortages, while the third maintained domestic employment and political stability but accelerated the technology gap. The decision, implicitly, was to continue production with minimal upgrades, a compromise that postponed immediate crisis at the cost of long-term competitiveness. During this period, internal assessments emphasized the export dilemma. Economists and industrial planners, including Sergei Ivanov of the State Planning Committee, calculated that each Lada exported at current prices generated between $3,000 and $5,000 in hard currency. Even a 10% decline in Western sales would reduce available foreign capital for critical industrial imports by tens of millions annually. This data underscored the growing vulnerability. AvtoVAZ's inability to modernize was no longer a matter of consumer inconvenience, it was a direct threat to the operational capacity of other Soviet industries. Efforts to adapt the Lada for limited technological advancement were partially successful. The introduction of fuel-efficient engines, incremental improvements to braking systems, and partial automation of assembly increased production quality slightly. Tolyatti, built explicitly to support AvtoVAZ, became a city whose economy was tightly coupled with a single industrial output. By 1988, nearly 70% of the city's workforce depended directly on the factory, including secondary suppliers of tires, glass, wiring harnesses, and components for stamping presses. Housing, public services, and transport infrastructure were aligned with production cycles. Any slowdown in factory output reverberated through the city. Supply chain disruptions, frequent by the late 1980s, created localized crises. Workers unable to complete shifts, materials stockpiled without use, and maintenance crews overwhelmed by machinery failures. By the end of the 1980s, Lada's declining export performance became intertwined with the USSR's overall economic fragility. Hard currency shortages prevented critical purchases, which prevented modernization, which in turn further degraded competitiveness. Analysts began describing a feedback loop. Outdated product lines led to reduced exports led to insufficient foreign capital prevented necessary industrial upgrades, and the cycle repeated. AvtoVAZ was no longer merely a car manufacturer, it was a mirror of the Soviet Union's systemic industrial and economic weaknesses. Concurrently, domestic demand for new vehicles remained suppressed. Waiting lists extended 5 to 10 years, reinforcing public perception that the state could not deliver basic consumer goods. Private ownership, once framed as a symbol of modern socialism, became a source of frustration. Despite the Lada's nominal reliability and affordability, aging models dominated Soviet streets. Maintenance shortages compounded by industrial inefficiency increased visible decay. Rust, failing brakes, and outdated electrical systems were omnipresent. The Soviet public, often unable to distinguish systemic constraints from managerial failure, increasingly associated the state's industrial stagnation with the car itself. The culmination of these pressures foreshadowed the final stage of AvtoVAZ's role in the Soviet collapse. By 1990, exports were sharply down. Hard currency inflows from Western buyers had fallen by nearly a third compared to the late 1970s. Domestic production faced frequent stoppages due to shortages of steel, wiring, and engine components. Industrial managers, including Polyakov and Timoshkin, implemented rationing of materials, scheduled multi-week shutdowns for maintenance, and diverted the limited available parts to export vehicles to sustain foreign contracts. The prioritization of external markets over domestic reliability exacerbated public discontent. By early 1991, the feedback loop had reached critical mass. AvtoVAZ, once the Soviet Union's flagship industrial achievement, had become emblematic of its stagnation. Tolyatti's economy remained dependent on a single aging industrial complex. Export revenue had contracted to the point that the state could not finance modernization across other industries. Equipment installed in the 1960s and 1970s failed faster than replacement parts could arrive. And in December 1991, when the Soviet Union officially dissolved, the factory continued to operate, but within a fundamentally broken system. The Lada, in its evolution from technological breakthrough to outdated relic, encapsulated the broader Soviet trajectory. Its story illustrated the consequences of centralized planning, reliance on a single industrial export, constrained innovation, and structural dependence on foreign currency. The peak of AvtoVAZ production had already passed. The feedback loops were irreversible. And as the 1990s began, the once celebrated people's car had become both a practical and symbolic indicator of systemic collapse.